For 9 years, I renewed every contract that kept my stepfather's $2 billion logistics empire running smoothly. So when his son handed me a termination letter for missing a birthday party, I did not cry or beg for my job back. I simply handed over my badge and gave him a 30-minute warning before every supplier on the planet halted their deliveries. My name is Fiona, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch someone else take credit for your hard work. The icy wind of Chicago whipped against the glass windows of the executive boardroom when I set down the heavy stack of shipping manifests. I was physically and emotionally exhausted. For 48 hours, I had been living on black coffee, negotiating non-stop to prevent a massive dockworker strike at our primary loading bays. If those negotiations had failed, our entire supply chain would have collapsed. I had succeeded. I had kept the empire safe just as I had done every day for 9 years. Sitting across the table was Cameron. He was my 28-year-old stepbrother, and he had just been appointed as the new vice president of operations. Cameron wore a custom-tailored Italian suit without a single strand of hair out of place. He spent the entire weekend celebrating his birthday on a chartered yacht on Lake Michigan. He certainly had not spent it fighting to save the company bottom line. Cameron did not look at the manifests. Instead, he pulled a single sheet of paper from his briefcase and slid it toward me. It was a formal termination of employment. The words "effective" immediately jumped off the page, making my stomach drop. "What is this, Cameron?" I asked, my voice raspy. He leaned back, steepling his fingers together with a smug smile. "It is exactly what it looks like, Fiona. You are fired." For what I demanded, keeping my tone level. "I just secured the West Coast shipping routes. The strike is officially called off. I saved us from a total operational shutdown." Cameron rolled his eyes. "You are being terminated for gross insubordination," he said smoothly. "You deliberately skipped my birthday gala last night. Our biggest investors were there, and you humiliated our family by refusing to show up." I stared at him in disbelief. "You are firing me for missing a party?" I asked. "A party you threw while the company was hours away from a total supply chain collapse." "It was not just a party, Fiona," he snapped. "It was a networking event. It was about presenting a unified front. But you have always thought you were better than the rest of us, just because you like to play in the dirt with the truck drivers and the dock workers." He stood up and walked around the table, stopping right next to me. He took in my wrinkled trousers, my sensible flat shoes, and the worn-out navy blazer I had slept in for 2 nights straight. "Dad always said you were a decent workhorse," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "But you just do not fit the executive image of our family. You lack the polish, the refinement, the class that this level of leadership requires. We need executives who know how to mingle with billionaires on yachts, not mechanics who smell like warehouse dust." His words cut deep, hitting every single insecurity my family had planted in my mind since I was a teenager. When my mother married his father, Harrison, I was brought into a world of extreme wealth and impossible standards. I was the scapegoat, the awkward stepdaughter who never quite fit into their pristine lifestyle. Cameron was the biological son, the golden child who could do no wrong. While he spent his 20s crashing sports cars, I spent mine in the mailroom, learning every aspect of the logistics industry. I built the very operational backbone that allowed him to afford his tailored suits. For a long time, I believed that if I just worked hard enough, my stepfather and my mother would finally accept me as an equal. I thought my dedication would buy me a place at their table. But standing there listening to a man who had never worked an honest day in his life call me a workhorse, I finally understood the truth. They would never see me as an equal. They only saw me as a tool to be used until I was no longer convenient. I looked down at the formal termination letter again. A wave of profound clarity washed over me, replacing the exhaustion. I did not feel the urge to cry or beg for my job. I simply felt done. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pen. Without a word, I signed my name at the bottom of the document. The ink flowed smoothly, sealing the end of 9 years of unappreciated loyalty. I unclipped my company identification badge and dropped it onto his pristine desk. Cameron watched me, his smug smile returning. He clearly expected a dramatic outburst. He wanted me to scream and yell so he could validate his narrative that I was unstable and unprofessional. When I remained completely silent, his smile widened into a look of pure triumph. "Security will escort you to the lobby," he said, gesturing toward the door. "You have 10 minutes to clear out your desk." I adjusted my worn-out blazer and picked up my purse. I looked at the large digital clock displayed on the boardroom wall. It was exactly 9 in the morning. "You have 30 minutes, Cameron," I said, my voice dangerously calm. He frowned, confused by my statement. 30 minutes for what? I looked him dead in the eye, feeling a surge of quiet power radiating through my tired body. "You have 30 minutes before every international supplier halts delivery across the entire global network. Tell your dad I said good luck." Cameron burst into laughter. It was a loud, echoing sound that bounced off the glass walls. "You are completely delusional, Fiona," he mocked, waving his hand dismissively. "You are a glorified logistics manager. You are nothing but an employee, and you are easily replaceable. Now get out of my boardroom." I did not bother to respond. I turned my back on him and walked out of the room, my sensible flat shoes making a steady rhythmic sound against the floor. I pressed the button for the elevator and watched the metal doors slide open. I stepped inside and turned around to face the boardroom one last time. Cameron was still standing by the table, shaking his head and laughing at my parting words. He reached for his coffee cup, taking a slow, relaxed sip, looking like a king surveying his newly conquered kingdom. Then his desk phone began to ring. It was a sharp, urgent sound that pierced the quiet of the executive floor. Cameron stopped laughing. He frowned, setting his coffee cup down, and walked over to his desk. I knew exactly who was on the other end of that line. It was the harbor master at the Port of Los Angeles, the largest shipping hub in our entire network. I quietly watched Cameron press the phone to his ear. I watched his posture stiffen. I watched the arrogant smugness drain completely from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. His mouth opened and closed, but he seemed unable to speak. The elevator doors began to close, sliding together and cutting off my view of his collapsing world. As the metal doors sealed shut, plunging me into the quiet descent toward the lobby, I allowed myself to smile. The countdown had officially begun, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The elevator ride down from the executive floor felt like descending into a completely different universe. My pulse hummed with a strange mixture of residual adrenaline and an unexpected profound peace. I bypassed the main atrium and walked quietly to my modest cubicle on the operations floor. It took me less than 5 minutes to pack my entire professional life into a single worn cardboard box. I carefully placed a framed photograph of my late biological father inside, along with a customized coffee mug given to me by the night shift warehouse crew and a small stubborn potted plant. I did not take a single company pen or a single printed memo. I did not even look back at the cluttered desk where I had sacrificed the best years of my 20s trying to prove my worth. I carried the heavy cardboard box toward the ground floor lobby. The corporate headquarters of my stepfather's logistics empire featured towering ceilings lined with imported Italian marble and a massive silver logo that dominated the wall behind the main reception desk. Usually, the lobby was a place of quiet, intimidating professionalism. Today, however, the polished atmosphere felt immediately hostile. The moment the elevator doors parted and I stepped out, my mother, Patricia, was waiting by the front reception desk. She wore a pristine white cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car, and her blonde hair was styled into perfect rigid waves that did not move as she turned her head. She tapped her manicured fingers impatiently against her expensive leather handbag. When she saw me walking toward the exit with my cardboard box clutched to my chest, her eyes narrowed in immediate vicious disapproval. She did not step forward to ask if I was okay. She did not ask why her daughter was carrying her personal belongings out of the building on a Tuesday morning. She simply marched across the marble floor, closing the distance between us with sharp clicking steps that echoed off the high walls. "What is the exact meaning of this, Fiona?" she hissed, keeping her voice low but entirely audible to the two receptionists standing just a few feet away. "Cameron just sent me a text message saying he had to let you go." Do you have any earthly idea how embarrassing this is for me right now? I adjusted, my grip on the cardboard box, feeling the rough edges dig into my tired palms. I worked a 48-hour shift to stop a major strike that would have ruined this entire company, Mom, I said, keeping my voice remarkably steady. Cameron fired me because I did not attend his birthday party on a yacht. My mother let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, waving her hand in the air, as if swatting away a minor annoyance, rather than my professional reality. You have always been so terribly jealous of Cameron and his birthright. Why could you not just show up to his party, put on a nice dress, and smile? Is that really so hard for you to manage? Harrison pays for your apartment, for goodness sake. The absolute least you could do is show some basic respect to his son. The cruel words hit me right in the chest, but they did not surprise me. My mother had always operated this exact way. When I was a vulnerable teenager and she married Harrison, she made it very clear to me that our new life of extreme luxury came with strict, unbending conditions. Harrison provided the immense wealth and the elite social status she so desperately craved, and in exchange we were expected to cater to his every single whim. More specifically, I was expected to quietly cater to Cameron. My mother viewed her second marriage as a highly lucrative business transaction, and I was just a minor lingering inconvenience she had to manage constantly to keep her position secure in high society. She never defended me when Harrison made belittling comments about my practical clothes or my demanding career choices. She looked the other way every time Cameron stole my logistical strategies and proudly presented them as his own brilliant ideas at Sunday family dinners. I was simply the price of admission to her pristine, perfect life, and she fully expected me to pay that price with a silent, grateful smile. Harrison does not pay for my apartment. I corrected her, my tone firm and unyielding. I pay for my own apartment with the salary I earn by doing the grueling jobs Cameron is too lazy to do, or rather the jobs I used to do. The two receptionists behind the polished desk exchanged wide-eyed glances, pretending to type on their keyboards while clearly hanging on to every single word of our confrontation. My mother noticed them listening, and her face flushed with a dark mixture of genuine anger and intense social panic. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my thin blazer sleeve. "Stop being so incredibly dramatic," she demanded, pulling me slightly away from the desk toward a decorative pillar. "You are ruining everything I have built here. Do you know how hard I have worked to keep this family together and maintain our reputation? You are acting like a spoiled, petulant child. I want you to turn around right now, march right back up to the executive suite and apologize to your brother." "He is not my brother," I replied, pulling my arm forcefully out of her tight grip. "He is a spoiled, incompetent tyrant who just tanked his father's global company because his fragile ego was bruised. I am not apologizing to him for saving his operation." "You will do exactly as I say," my mother shot back, her voice rising in pitch and losing its refined edge. "You will go up there and you will beg for your job back. Tell Cameron you were stressed out and exhausted. Tell him you were acting irrationally. Tell him you will work down in the mailroom if you have to. Just fix this mess right now before Harrison finds out and blames me for your utter incompetence." I stood perfectly still and stared at the woman standing in front of me. I looked at her expensive coat, her diamond earrings, and the absolute lack of maternal warmth in her eyes. I had twisted myself into emotional knots trying to be the perfect daughter. I foolishly believed she would eventually choose me over the money. I finally realized standing in that cold lobby that day was never going to come. "No," I said simply. My mother blinked, her expression freezing in pure shock. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" "I am not going back upstairs," I replied, shifting the box to rest on my hip. "I am done being the emotional punching bag for this toxic family." My mother's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "You really think you can survive out there without us?" she mocked, her voice turning ice cold. "I am calling the family lawyers this very afternoon. I am officially cutting you out of the family trust to help pay for that new sports car Cameron wants. He actually deserves it." I just smiled. The threat liberated me. I turned my back on her and walked out into the freezing Chicago wind, completely and finally free from them forever. The freezing wind cut through my thin blazer the moment the revolving glass doors pushed me out onto the Chicago pavement. I pulled my coat tighter, shivering as the bitter chill bit into my skin, but for the first time in a decade, the cold did not bother me. I crossed the intersection and walked toward a small coffee shop across the street from the headquarters of my stepfather's logistics empire. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside. I ordered a simple black coffee and relished the transaction, carrying my paper cup and cardboard box. I found a small wooden table right by the front window. It offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the corporate tower's main entrance. I set my box on the empty chair and wrapped my hands around the warm cup. I took a deliberate sip and let my eyes travel up the sleek glass facade. Somewhere up there, Cameron was likely still admiring his new desk, completely oblivious to the massive invisible timer ticking down toward zero. I checked my wristwatch. 20 minutes had already passed while I was dealing with my mother in the lobby. I had exactly 10 minutes left to wait. The sheer magnitude of what I had just done began to settle over me, but it did not bring fear. Instead, it brought a steadying sense of vindication. For years, I had been the invisible glue holding that massive company together. I sacrificed my weekends, my holidays, and my sleep to ensure that our international freight lines ran without a single hiccup. Harrison and Cameron took all the credit, assuming the system ran on autopilot. They fundamentally misunderstood that the network ran on the grueling relationships I had built with overseas suppliers and the software infrastructure I had personally customized. I watched a city bus rumble past my window, temporarily blocking my view. When it cleared away, I focused my attention back on the heavy glass doors of the headquarters. I counted the seconds in my head. My pulse remained steady. I did not need to log into a computer or send an explosive email to trigger the fallout. I had designed the override protocol months ago strictly as a failsafe against catastrophic cyber attacks. The system was tied directly to my active employee credentials. The moment human resources processed Cameron's termination order and deactivated my executive badge, the automated sequence initiated its final countdown. 5 minutes left, 3 minutes, 1 minute. Exactly 30 minutes after I had signed that termination paper, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the tabletop. The screen lit up with a bright red notification banner. It was an automated alert generated by my private encrypted server. I picked up the phone and read the text displayed across the glass screen. Global supply chain override activated. 400 active international fleets halted. Master vendor contracts suspended pending authorized user verification. It was done. The digital connecting my stepfather's billion-dollar company to the actual physical movement of goods across the globe had been completely severed. I kept my eyes locked on the street outside. Logistics is an industry built on constant perpetual motion. When you freeze the gears of a machine that large, the friction becomes visible almost immediately. It started on the street right in front of the headquarters. Two massive delivery trucks bearing our company logo were scheduled to pull into the underground loading bays. Instead of making the turn, the lead truck suddenly hit the brakes and pulled over sharply to the curb. The driver hopped out of the cab, staring at a digital tablet in his hands, looking visibly confused. A second truck pulled up right behind him. Within 3 minutes, a line of idling freight trucks began to back up down the city block. I shifted my gaze to the glass walls of the ground floor lobby. The quiet professionalism I had left behind was rapidly dissolving into absolute chaos. Even from across the street, I could see the frantic movement. The two receptionists who had watched my mother berate me were now standing up at their desks, wildly gesturing to a group of men in dark suits. Executives were sprinting out of the elevator banks and waving their arms. Security guards were scrambling toward the front doors, trying to manage the confused truck drivers who were now attempting to enter the lobby. The entire central nervous system of the empire was shutting down in real time. My phone began to vibrate in my hand, shattering my focus on the scene unfolding across the street. I looked down at the caller identification. It was Cameron. I let it ring 4 times, watching his name flash across the screen. I wanted him to feel the exact weight of the operational panic I had managed for him every single day for 9 years. On the 5th ring, I calmly swiped my thumb across the screen and brought the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end. "Fiona, what did you do?" Cameron demanded, his voice entirely stripped of the arrogant smugness he had worn in the boardroom just an hour ago. He sounded out of breath, as if he had been physically running around the executive floor. I took a slow, quiet breath. I did exactly what you asked, Cameron. I cleared out my desk and I left the building. "Do not play games with me," he shouted, panic bleeding through his thin veneer of authority. Every single routing screen on the operations floor just went completely black. The warehouse managers are calling me saying their loading authorizations are locked. The port authorities in Shanghai are holding our cargo ships at the docks because the vendor contracts are suspended in the global registry. Fix this right now. I watched another executive run out of the front doors of the building, holding a phone to his ear and looking frantically up and down the street. "I am afraid I cannot help you with that, Cameron," I replied. "You are the only one with the administrative access codes to the primary routing software," he yelled, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "I have investors calling my private line asking why our stock algorithms are flagging a massive supply chain disruption. You need to log in remotely and fix whatever glitch you caused before our European clients cancel their accounts. I will give you your job back. Just turn the system back on, Fiona." I took one final slow sip of my warm coffee. I looked at the cardboard box sitting across from me, containing the few items I had salvaged from nearly a decade of unappreciated loyalty. I thought about my mother demanding I beg for my job. I thought about Cameron firing me for missing a party. "There is no software glitch, Cameron," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper. "The system is working exactly as it was designed to work. You fired the only person holding your entire supply chain together. I told you that you had 30 minutes and you chose to laugh. Fiona, please," he begged, sounding like the spoiled child he truly was. "You have to fix this." I smiled, watching the chaos consume the lobby across the street. "I do not work there anymore, Cameron," I said. Then I ended the call and turned my phone completely off. It had been exactly 4 hours since I walked out of that polished corporate lobby and left my mother standing alone by the decorative pillar. I was now sitting safely inside my modest one-bedroom apartment, far away from the towering glass facades of the downtown business district. The quiet atmosphere of my living room was profound, a stark contrast to the ringing phones and shouting managers I dealt with daily. I set my cardboard box on the kitchen counter and unpacked my few personal items, placing the framed photograph of my late biological father carefully on the bookshelf. I made myself a simple cup of tea and sat down at my small wooden dining table, letting the residual adrenaline finally fade from my system. My apartment was small, with worn hardwood floors and drafty windows, but it was entirely mine. I paid the rent with my own money, and I answered to no one inside these walls. I opened my personal laptop and pulled up the public industry forums to monitor the situation unfolding across the country. The entire global logistics network of my stepfather's $2 billion empire remained completely and utterly paralyzed. The sheer scale of the disruption was staggering to witness from the outside. The digital transportation message boards were absolutely exploding with confused and panicked updates from every corner of the globe. Truckers were posting photographs of massive bottlenecks at our loading docks from Los Angeles to Newark. The drivers were stranded in their cabs, unable to receive their electronic gate clearances because the routing software had locked them out entirely. Dock workers on the coasts were reporting that their digital cargo manifests had completely frozen, preventing thousands of shipping containers from being cleared for offloading. International shipping vessels were dropping anchor in the bays, forced to wait in holding patterns because the master contracts were showing up as suspended in the global registry. The cross-country freight lines were grounded with train conductors waiting for operational green lights that were never going to come. The central nervous system of the empire had suffered a fatal collapse, all because Cameron thought he could fire the one person who actually understood how the intricate machinery worked. For years, my family had taken my relentless dedication for granted, assuming the immense wealth pouring into their bank accounts was simply the natural order of things. They believed the cargo moved because Harrison demanded it to move. They were currently learning the very hard lesson that the cargo only moved because I facilitated the complex relationships with the overseas suppliers. I read an alert detailing a massive drop in company stock as rumors of a cyber attack circulated among major investors. I felt no guilt watching the financial bleeding. They had built their entire wealthy reality on my back, and then discarded me the moment I became inconvenient. Now they were experiencing exactly what my absence looked like. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I had turned it completely off during my commute home to ensure I could not be tracked or harassed by my frantic stepbrother. I held down the power button and waited for the screen to illuminate. The moment the device connected to the cellular network, it began to vibrate uncontrollably against the tabletop. Notifications flooded the glass screen in a rapid, endless stream. There were dozens of missed calls, hundreds of furious text messages, and a barrage of emergency automated alerts from the corporate office. I ignored the frantic text messages and opened my digital voicemail inbox. The most recent message was from Cameron left just 15 minutes ago. I pressed play and held the phone speaker to my ear. Cameron did not sound like a smug, commanding vice president anymore. He sounded completely unhinged, breathless, and terrified. "Fiona, you are going to federal prison!" he screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with panic and raw rage. "I have the entire legal department sitting in my office right now. We are drafting a lawsuit that will absolutely destroy you. You are going to be charged with corporate sabotage and cyber terrorism by the end of the day. You do not own this company, and you do not have the right to hold our global supply chain hostage. Turn the administrative software back on right now, or our lawyers will take everything you own and throw you in a concrete cell for the rest of your miserable life." He ended the message by slamming the phone down so hard the audio crackled and popped against my eardrum. I did not delete the threatening voicemail. I saved the audio file and immediately forwarded it to my personal attorney, Donovan. I had quietly retained Donovan 3 years ago when I first realized my deeply toxic family might eventually try to throw me under the bus for one of their reckless financial mistakes. He was a sharp, pragmatic lawyer who understood complex corporate structures better than anyone I knew. I dialed his direct number and he answered on the second ring. "I assume you listened to the voicemail I just sent over," I said, keeping my voice perfectly relaxed. "I did," Donovan replied, letting out a short, amused chuckle. "Your stepbrother sounds like a man who just realized he forgot how to swim while standing in the deep end of the ocean." "Do I need to be worried about his threats to sue me into oblivion?" I asked, tracing the warm rim of my teacup. "Absolutely not," Donovan assured me, his tone brimming with professional confidence. "Cameron has absolutely no legal standing here. He is threatening you with corporate sabotage, but you did not sabotage anything. You simply stopped providing a professional service the exact moment you were formally terminated. He handed you a termination letter, releasing you from all professional obligations to his company. Since they do not actually own the vendor contracts and the system operates entirely under your private limited liability company, they have zero legal right to demand access to your proprietary network. Let him throw his little tantrum, Fiona. They are legally powerless." I thanked Donovan and ended the call, feeling a block of reassurance settle into my chest. I set the phone down on the table, but it immediately lit up again with another incoming call. The caller identification did not show Cameron or my mother. It showed Harrison. My stepfather and the chief executive officer of the Bleeding Empire was calling me directly. I took a deep, steadying breath, bracing myself for the impending explosion, and answered the call. I did not say hello, I just sat and waited. The line was quiet for a moment, save for the distinct low hum of jet engines in the background. Harrison was calling me from his private aircraft, likely rushing back to Chicago to deal with the crisis. When he finally spoke, he did not yell. He was terrifyingly calm. His voice was a smooth, icy drawl that sent a reflexive chill down my spine. "You have had your fun, Fiona," he said, measuring every single syllable carefully. "You have thrown your little tantrum and you have made your point. Now we are going to fix this. You are going to come to the estate for a mandatory family dinner tonight at 8. You will sit down at my dining table, and you will fix this before I truly ruin your life forever." The drive to the sprawling suburban estate of Harrison took nearly an hour in the thick evening traffic. As my car tires crunched over the pristine gravel of the long, sweeping driveway, I felt a familiar heavy knot form in my stomach. The massive brick mansion stood illuminated against the dark winter sky, projecting an aura of untouchable wealth and absolute authority. For years I had approached these heavy oak front doors with a deep sense of anxiety, always bracing myself for the inevitable criticisms about my clothes, my career, and my general lack of social grace. Tonight, however, my steps were measured and calm. I rang the brass doorbell and waited. The door swung open to reveal the family housekeeper, who offered me a sympathetic but strained smile before pointing me toward the formal dining room. I did not take off my worn navy blazer. I walked down the long, echoing hallway, listening to the muted clinking of crystal and silver. When I stepped into the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with manufactured tension. The long mahogany table was set for a formal dinner, but no one was actually eating. Patricia sat perfectly straight, clutching a wineglass. Cameron was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking flushed and frantic. Harrison sat at the head of the table, radiating a cold, furious energy. The moment I crossed the threshold, Cameron stopped pacing and glared at me. Nobody offered me a seat. Nobody offered me a drink. My mother let out a loud, exasperated sigh, setting her wineglass down onto the table with a sharp clink. Fiona, she began using that syrupy, condescending tone she reserved for unruly children. We are all so incredibly tired of this unnecessary drama. Cameron had a momentary lapse in judgment this morning, but your reaction has been completely disproportionate. We are a family, and families simply do not behave this way toward one another. She gestured toward the empty chair across from Harrison, expecting me to sit down and accept my reprimand. I remained standing, keeping my distance from the table. Cameron did not have a lapse in judgment, Mom, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. He handed me a legally binding termination letter and ordered security to escort me out of the building. Harrison held up his hand, demanding immediate silence. His face was a mask of rigid control, but the slight tremor in his jaw betrayed his underlying panic. Let us stop playing these ridiculous games, Fiona, he commanded, his deep voice echoing in the large room. You were never officially fired. Cameron was merely issuing a temporary suspension to teach you some basic respect for the executive hierarchy. You have made your point, and you have proven that your little computer programs are important to the daily operations. Now it is time for you to sit down, act like a professional, and turn the routing systems back on before this company loses another dime. They were trying to gaslight me in real time. They honestly believed they could rewrite reality simply by stating their version of events loudly enough. I looked at Harrison and let a small, humorless smile cross my face. I signed the paperwork, Harrison. I handed over my corporate badge. I am no longer an employee of your company, and I am certainly not going to fix the catastrophic mess your son created. Cameron let out a desperate, angry sound and started to step forward, but Harrison waved him back. Harrison reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a slim leather checkbook. He unscrewed a gold fountain pen and quickly scribbled across the paper. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he tore the check free and slid it across the polished mahogany table toward the empty chair. The piece of paper stopped near the edge, facing me. I did not need to step closer to read the bold numbers printed across the center. It was a cashier check made out to me for $50,000. Consider this a generous bonus for your past dedication, Harrison said, leaning back in his chair and folding his arms across his chest. Take the money, Fiona. Go buy yourself a nicer apartment and a new wardrobe. Take a week off to rest. But you will log into your laptop right now and restore global access to the supply chain. If you refuse to accept this very generous olive branch, I will make sure you never work in the logistics industry again. I know every major executive in the Midwest. I will blackball you so thoroughly, you will not even be able to get a job driving a delivery truck. The threat was explicit and brutally clear. He was offering me a small bribe wrapped in a massive career-ending ultimatum. Harrison leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. I built this company from nothing, he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. I created this empire with my own two hands, and you owe me absolutely everything. I provided the roof over your head when your mother brought you here. I gave you a job when you were a useless college graduate with no real-world experience. You are going to fix my supply lines right now, or I will bury you. I looked at the $50,000 check resting on the table, and then I looked directly into the angry eyes of Harrison. You did not build this company from nothing, Harrison. I said, my voice steady and loud enough to fill the entire room. And you certainly did not build it with your own two hands. You inherited a functional business, and you nearly ran it into the ground. My mother gasped, clutching her pearls in genuine shock at my disrespect, but I did not stop speaking. 5 years ago, you tried to hide millions of dollars in offshore accounts to avoid your massive tax liabilities. You completely botched the paperwork, and the federal regulators were hours away from freezing your entire operational budget. You were terrified of going to federal prison. You brought me into this very dining room crying and begging me to fix your mess because you knew I was the only person smart enough to understand the complex corporate tax loopholes. You forced me to set up an independent offshore limited liability company in my own name to shield your assets, I reminded him, watching the color slowly drain from his arrogant face. You told me I was just a naive girl handling basic administrative paperwork. You assumed I was too stupid to understand the massive amount of leverage you were handing me. I stepped forward and placed my hands firmly on the edge of the heavy mahogany table. I pushed the $50,000 check right back across the polished wood toward him. It fluttered slightly before coming to a complete stop against his crystal water glass. Then I reached into the deep inside pocket of my worn navy blazer. I pulled out a single heavily redacted legal document. I set it down flat on the table right where his check had been just moments ago. This single piece of paper changes absolutely everything for you today. You thought you could just throw me away when you were finished using me. You thought I would just disappear quietly. You were completely wrong about me, Harrison. I smiled as he stared at the document. Checkmate. The silence in the dining room became absolute. I could hear the steady rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock standing in the hallway. I watched Harrison stare down at the heavy black redactions on the legal document. For a long moment he did not move a single muscle. His eyes tracked across the thick parchment, processing the legal jargon and undeniable corporate seals stamped proudly at the bottom. Beside him, Cameron shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other, clearly unable to comprehend the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Cameron leaned forward, trying to read the document upside down, but the dense legal language was far beyond his limited understanding. "What is that?" Cameron asked, his voice suddenly tight with growing impatience. "Dad, what is she showing you? Just tear it up and call the local police." Harrison did not answer his son. He slowly reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a pair of silver wire-rimmed reading glasses. He slipped them onto his face and leaned closer to the table, reading the first paragraph again. When he finally looked up, the rigid mask of arrogant control had completely vanished from his face. His skin had turned a sickly shade of pale gray, and his jaw hung slightly open. He looked exactly like a man who had just stepped off a cliff in the dark without a parachute. "That is a certified copy of the master licensing agreement for your 3 largest international freight suppliers," I said, keeping my voice smooth and conversational. "The European Maritime Coalition, the Pacific Shipping Conglomerate, and the Transatlantic Union. Those entities represent over 75% of your annual revenue. Without them, your delivery trucks have nothing to carry across the country." Cameron scoffed, letting out a harsh laugh. "You are lying," he snapped, pointing an angry finger at me. "We own those contracts. We have owned those routes for a decade. You are just trying to bluff your way out of a massive corporate lawsuit." I did not even look at Cameron. I kept my eyes on Harrison because he was the only person in the room who understood what the document actually meant. "We do not own them," I said quietly. "I do." Harrison swallowed hard. His eyes dropped back to the signature page, and for the first time that evening, he looked less angry than frightened. The important part was no longer the tax crisis that had created the arrangement. The important part was that once the crisis passed, Harrison had never bothered to unwind it. He had assumed the company in my name was nothing more than a storage box he could open whenever he pleased. Legally, it was not. Patricia leaned toward him. "Harrison, what exactly did you sign?" she asked. He ignored her. His fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. I answered for him. 5 years ago, when you transferred the supplier agreements into my private company, you signed documents that named my company as the contracting party and gave it control of the licensing rights. You were so focused on keeping the routes outside the threatened asset freeze that you never demanded an automatic transfer back. You never created a clause that returned ownership to your empire when the emergency ended. You left the agreements where you put them under my company with my signature controlling access. Cameron stepped toward the table, his confidence starting to crack. That does not make them yours, he snapped. You worked for us. Anything you handled belonged to the company. Harrison finally looked at him, and the expression on his face silenced him. He knew Cameron was wrong. The contracts did not list me as a company employee signing on Harrison's behalf. They listed my limited liability company as the independent holder of the rights. I tapped the certified agreement with one finger. For 5 years, you benefited from an arrangement you never bothered to understand, because I kept it functioning. You saw my name on the paperwork and assumed my name meant nothing. Tonight you are finally learning the difference between controlling a person and controlling a contract. I am the sole owner of the company named on these agreements, and that company holds the exclusive licensing authority for the 3 supplier networks sitting behind 75% of your revenue. For the last 5 years, I have been quietly sublicensing those routes back to your logistics empire for a nominal fee, ensuring the cargo kept moving and you kept getting richer. Cameron shook his head wildly, his face flushing with panicked confusion. "This is completely illegal!" he shouted out, his voice violently cracking. "You cannot just steal our massive supply lines. You are an employee. Any legal contract you hold permanently belongs to the company." "That is the best part of this entire situation," I replied, turning my attention to my stepbrother for the very first time. "I am not an employee anymore, Cameron. You fired me. You handed me a formal termination letter this morning, and you had security escort me off the premises." The sublicensing agreement between my private company and this empire was strictly contingent upon my active employment status. By firing me, you legally severed this company from its only access to those supply lines. You did not just fire me from my job, Cameron. You fired your entire global network. The reality of his catastrophic mistake crashed into Cameron all at once. He stumbled backward, hitting the floor-to-ceiling window and sliding down the cold glass slightly. He looked at his father with wide, terrified eyes, desperately waiting for Harrison to quickly fix the massive problem. But Harrison could not fix it. The calm, terrifying demeanor my stepfather had projected all evening finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The grand illusion of his total control was completely gone. Harrison stood up violently, pushing his heavy dining chair backward. The chair legs scraped loudly against the expensive hardwood floor. In his sudden blind rage, his hand struck his crystal wine glass. The glass tipped over and shattered against the polished mahogany, sending a thick, dark wave of expensive red wine spilling across the table like fresh blood. "You vindictive brat," Harrison roared, his voice booming off the walls. "I will crush you in federal court. I will hire an army of lawyers and bury you under litigation until you rot in a jail cell." His screaming did not frighten me. I stood my ground, watching him reduce himself to a violent temper tantrum. Suddenly, a blur of white cashmere rushed toward me. My mother Patricia lunged across the space separating us, her face twisted with an ugly, desperate rage. "You are destroying this family," she screamed at the top of her lungs. Before I could react, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp sting of the impact echoed in the large room. I did not flinch. I slowly turned to look my mother directly in the eyes. I reached up and calmly dabbed my burning cheek with my fingertips. It confirmed I owed these people absolutely nothing. "I promise you total absolute ruin," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy calm. Without waiting for a response, I turned my back and walked out of the dining room, leaving them drowning in the mess they had created. The crisp winter air hit my face as I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my car. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my shoes, providing a steady rhythm to my escape. For the first time in 9 years, my shoulders did not carry the crushing weight of Harrison and his demanding logistics empire. I slid into the driver's seat of my practical sedan and started the engine, letting the heater thaw my cold hands before gripping the steering wheel. The drive back to the city felt entirely different from the anxious commute I had made earlier that evening. I turned on the radio, letting a soft jazz melody fill the small space and drown out the residual noise of my mother screaming in my ears. My heart was still beating a little faster than normal, but it was a steady, triumphant rhythm. I had finally stood up for myself. I had looked the people who used and abused me directly in the eyes, and I had taken back my power. The streetlights of Chicago blurred past my windshield, looking brighter and more welcoming than they had in years. I pulled into the small assigned parking lot behind my modest brick apartment building and turned off the ignition. I sat there for a brief moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled down. I was completely exhausted, but looking forward to a long hot shower and a good night of sleep in my own safe space. I grabbed my purse, locked the car doors, and walked toward the side entrance, feeling lighter with every single step. The building was quiet as I pushed through the heavy glass door and stepped into the familiar, warmly lit lobby. The scent of old pine and industrial floor cleaner greeted me like an old friend. I checked my small metal mailbox, out of habit, finding nothing inside but a few glossy grocery store flyers and a coupon catalog. I tossed them into the recycling bin, walked to the elevator, and pressed the tarnished brass button for the fourth floor. The old metal doors slid shut with a heavy mechanical clunk, and the machine groaned as it slowly lifted me upward through the building shaft. I leaned my head against the back wall, closing my eyes and replaying the look of absolute horror on Harrison's face when he finally understood the leverage I held over his precious company. The elevator chimed softly, announcing my arrival on the fourth floor. The doors parted, and I stepped out onto the worn, patterned carpet of the quiet residential hallway. I reached into my purse to find my keys, but my hand froze halfway inside the dark bag. There were 3 large cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly right in the middle of the narrow corridor directly outside my apartment door. I stopped walking, my brain struggling to process the visual information. My initial thought was that a neighbor was moving out or receiving a massive furniture delivery. But as I took a slow, cautious step closer, my heart suddenly dropped straight into my stomach. I recognized the familiar blue and white geometric pattern of my favorite winter blanket spilling out of the top box. I saw my collection of vintage logistics textbooks stacked carelessly in the second box, with pages bent and bindings damaged. Sitting on the very top of the pile was the framed photograph of my late biological father, the exact same one I had carried out of the corporate headquarters earlier that morning. These were not random deliveries belonging to a stranger. These were my deeply personal belongings discarded in the public hallway. A cold, heavy knot formed in my throat as I rushed forward and dropped my purse onto the floor. Someone had been inside my home. My personal safe sanctuary had been completely violated while I was standing in Harrison's dining room defending myself. I grabbed my keyring and jammed the brass house key into the deadbolt of my front door. The key slid in halfway and then completely stopped. I pulled it out and tried again, forcing it with a panicked grunt, but the metal teeth refused to align. The lock had been completely changed. I stepped back, my breathing growing shallow and fast. That was when I noticed the stark white piece of paper taped securely to the center of the wooden door. My hands were visibly shaking as I reached up and peeled the tape away from the wood. The document was an official notice of immediate eviction. The bold black letters at the top stated that my month-to-month lease agreement had been unilaterally terminated due to an emergency building compliance code violation. I read the paragraphs of dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the page for any logical explanation. The notice claimed the property management company was taking immediate possession of the unit for hazardous material remediation, forcing all occupants to vacate the premises without the standard 30-day notice. It was a blatant, illegal lie. But what caught my attention and made the blood freeze in my veins was the signature block at the very bottom of the page. The eviction notice was not signed by my usual friendly building manager. It was signed by an executive officer of a property management limited liability company called Horizon Holdings. My mind raced back to the long nights I spent organizing my stepfather complex tax structures. Horizon Holdings was not an independent real estate firm. It was a quiet shadow corporation secretly controlled by Harrison. I secretly owned my apartment building. Harrison purchased the property through his shell company years ago to keep an invisible leash on my personal life. He had been acting as my landlord this entire time, monitoring my housing situation while pretending I was completely independent. When I refused his $50,000 bribe and threatened his logistics empire, he simply made a phone call and ordered his property managers to throw me out onto the street. He orchestrated this eviction while I was driving to his estate, ensuring I would return home to find my life upended. My phone buzzed inside my purse on the floor, cutting through the silent hallway. I knelt down and retrieved the device, swiping the screen to see a new message. It was from my mother. I opened it and read the cruel, gloating words illuminating the glass screen. "See what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. Come to the office and apologize tomorrow or sleep on the street. The choice is yours." I stared at the bright letters, feeling profound disbelief and intense rising fury. This was no longer just a corporate dispute over supply lines and software. They were not simply trying to force me to turn their network back on. My family was actively attempting to destroy my entire life. They wanted to strip away my shelter and security until I was so desperate I had no choice but to crawl back to them on my hands and knees. I looked at my belongings sitting in boxes in the cold hallway. I was currently homeless, locked out of my apartment in the middle of a freezing Chicago winter. But as I read my mother's arrogant message again, the panic in my chest transformed into a burning, unshakable resolve. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. They wanted a war, and I was finally ready to give them one. I gathered my 3 cardboard boxes from the freezing hallway one by one and carried them down the stairs to my sedan. My arms ached from the physical exertion, but my mind was completely clear. I loaded my belongings into the trunk, slammed it shut, and drove straight to a quiet extended stay hotel on the edge of the downtown district. I booked a room for the week, paying in cash to avoid leaving an immediate digital trail for Harrison to follow. Once inside the sterile, anonymous hotel room, I unpacked my laptop and set it on the small glass desk. I did not sleep that night. I spent the dark hours mapping out the operational structure of my new independent consulting firm. By the time the sun began to rise over the city, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I walked down to the hotel lobby to grab a cup of coffee and a complimentary copy of the local financial newspaper. I planned to spend the morning contacting my most trusted industry connections to officially announce my departure from my stepfather's empire. But as I unfolded the crisp newspaper and glanced at the front page, the warm coffee in my stomach suddenly turned to ice. There was a large photograph of me printed just below the main fold. It was an unflattering picture taken at a corporate charity event 3 years ago. The bold black headline above my face read, "Executive Meltdown Leads to Termination at Chicago Logistics Giant." I stared at the harsh words, my hands gripping the edges of the newspaper so tightly the paper began to tear. I quickly scanned the article, reading paragraph after paragraph of absolute fabricated garbage. The journalist cited multiple anonymous senior sources within the company who claimed I was escorted out of the building after suffering a violent mental breakdown in the boardroom. The article detailed wild accusations stating I was fired for gross insubordination and suspected financial embezzlement. The anonymous sources, which were clearly just Cameron and my mother, feeding lies to a friendly reporter, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed, disgruntled employee who could not handle the pressure of the logistics industry. They even managed to weave in a subtle mention of my abrupt eviction, framing it as a consequence of my erratic personal behavior rather than a calculated retaliatory strike by a vindictive landlord. My family was moving faster than I had anticipated. They could not legally force me to hand over the supplier contracts, so they were trying to destroy my professional reputation before I could even step onto the battlefield. They wanted to make sure that when I reached out to the major freight clients, nobody would take my calls. They were branding me as toxic and untouchable. I threw the newspaper into a nearby trash can and rushed back up to my hotel room. I opened my laptop and logged into my professional networking accounts. The digital damage was already spreading like an aggressive virus. Several prominent industry executives I had worked with for years were actively disconnecting from my profile. I clicked on my inbox and found 3 separate emails from reliable vendors canceling our tentative lunch meetings for the week. They all used vague, polite excuses about scheduling conflicts, But the underlying message was brutally clear. The smear campaign was working. I refused to let panic take hold. I closed the email tab and pulled up a list of commercial real estate brokers I had compiled during the night. If I was going to launch my limited liability company as a standalone consulting firm and steal Harrison's clients, I needed a legitimate physical office space immediately. I needed a professional headquarters to prove I was a stable, serious competitor, not the unhinged embezzler portrayed in the morning news. I dialed the number for the first broker on my list. He was a man who had practically begged for my business a year ago when I was looking for warehouse expansions for the empire. The phone rang twice before he answered. I greeted him warmly and explained I was looking for a premium office suite in the downtown loop. The moment I stated my full name, the cheerful tone in his voice completely vanished. He stammered through a brief, awkward apology, claiming his firm was entirely booked for the next 6 months, and quickly hung up the phone. By the time I reached the fifth real estate broker, my frustration was boiling over. This broker was an older man who had known my late biological father. When I asked him to show me a property, he let out a heavy, sympathetic sigh. "Fiona," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cautious whisper. "You are a smart girl, so I am going to be straight with you. Do not bother calling anyone else in the city today." Harrison put out a shadow blacklist to every major commercial property firm in Chicago first thing this morning. He made it perfectly clear that anyone who leases an office to you will permanently lose his company as a client. Nobody is going to risk millions in corporate real estate commissions to rent you a suite. You are completely locked out of the market. I thanked him for his honesty and ended the call. I set my phone down on the glass desk and rubbed my tired eyes. Harrison and Patricia were systematically severing every single lifeline I had. They had taken my home, they had poisoned my professional reputation, and now they were using their massive wealth to blockade me from establishing a competing business. They wanted me isolated, desperate, and entirely powerless. Suddenly, a quiet chime echoed from the desk behind me. The sound had come from my mobile phone. I picked up the device and saw a notification banner from a secure encrypted messaging application I rarely used. I unlocked the phone and opened the application. The text read, "Fiona, this is Mia. Please confirm you are the only person reading this." Mia was my incredibly loyal former administrative assistant. She knew more about the daily operations of the company than Cameron ever would. I quickly typed back, confirming my identity and ensuring her the connection was entirely secure. 3 seconds later, a massive block of text appeared on my screen, followed by several attached files. I started reading the message, my eyes widening with every single sentence. Mia explained that the chaos was not just from the frozen international supply lines. Cameron was actively making the situation infinitely worse and doing it on purpose. Mia wrote, "Cameron is terrified that Harrison is going to realize he cannot fix the vendor contracts, so he is intentionally sabotaging the domestic shipping routes to create a massive paper trail. He is manually rerouting the cross-country freight trucks to the wrong distribution centers, causing thousands of pounds of perishable cargo to spoil on the loading docks. He is creating fake error logs in the administrative system to make it look like someone hacked the domestic grid from an outside server. He is gathering all this fabricated data to present to the board of directors this afternoon. He is going to blame all the destroyed cargo and the financial losses entirely on you. He wants to have you arrested for corporate sabotage to cover up his own catastrophic incompetence." I downloaded the encrypted files directly to my secure server and smiled. The war had officially escalated, and I was no longer playing defense. I closed the encrypted messaging application and took a deep, steadying breath, letting the reality of Cameron's desperate sabotage settle into my mind. My personal cell phone vibrated again, this time with a standard incoming call. The caller identification showed the name of my Aunt Judy, my mother's older sister, who lived down in Florida. I had not spoken to her since the holidays. I answered the phone expecting a simple, polite check-in, but her tone immediately put me on high alert. She spoke in very hushed and deeply dramatic tones, asking if I was safe and if I needed her to wire me money for a private psychiatric facility. I slowly asked her what in the world she was talking about. Judy explained that Patricia had spent the entire morning calling every single extended family member, crying hysterically into the receiver. Patricia claimed I had suffered a massive psychotic break, that I was physically dangerous, and that I had violently attacked Cameron in the boardroom by throwing a heavy chair across the table before fleeing into the city streets. She explicitly warned everyone not to answer my phone calls or offer me shelter, claiming I was experiencing severe unhinged delusions and needed immediate forced institutionalization for my own personal health and safety. This was not just a professional smear campaign anymore. My mother was deliberately salting the earth of my personal life. She wanted me completely isolated, cutting off any potential emotional support system I might lean on in a moment of extreme crisis. I calmly assured Aunt Judy that I was perfectly fine and that Patricia was wildly exaggerating a simple corporate disagreement. I could hear the lingering doubt in her voice when we said our goodbyes. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the cheap hotel bed. They wanted me to feel utterly alone and entirely terrified. Instead, I felt a profound, liberating clarity. They had severed the final threads of my familial loyalty, freeing me to fight back without any hesitation or lingering guilt. I opened a secure browser window on my laptop and logged directly into the global corporate banking portal for my offshore limited liability company. For 5 grueling years, I had completely ignored these specific accounts, letting the massive sublicensing fees accumulate silently without ever touching a single dime. I navigated to the primary balance screen and watched the encrypted numbers load across the display. The revenue streams generated by my exclusive vendor contracts over the last 48 hours alone were absolutely staggering. With Harrison's empire completely locked out, the international shipping conglomerates were automatically routing their emergency penalty fees and direct access tariffs straight into my private holding accounts. I was sitting on a massive mountain of liquid capital. For the first time in my life, I realized I had significantly more financial power than the people who had always treated me like a disposable charity case. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct number for a premier luxury residential real estate agency located in the downtown Loop. Harrison could use his immense wealth to block me from leasing commercial office spaces, but he did not have the same iron grip on the private luxury housing market. I spoke with a senior leasing agent and told her I needed immediate permanent occupancy of a premium penthouse suite in a high-security residential building. I did not ask for a virtual tour, and I did not attempt to negotiate the exorbitant monthly price. I simply told her I would be paying for an entire 12-month lease upfront in full via a direct international wire transfer. Within 3 short hours, I was standing inside a sprawling, magnificent penthouse on the 50th floor of a modern glass skyscraper. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the bustling Chicago skyline and the freezing dark waters of Lake Michigan. The vast space was fully furnished with sleek modern decor and featured a dedicated home office suite equipped with multiple high-speed internet connections. I walked through the massive, pristine living room, running my hand along the cool, smooth edge of the marble kitchen island. The prestigious building featured 24-hour private security restricted elevator access, requiring a key fob and a private underground parking garage. I was completely untouchable in this sky-high sanctuary. Harrison and Patricia could never evict me from this fortress. The sheer luxury of the space was a stark, beautiful contrast to the worn cardboard box of belongings I had carried out of the corporate lobby just yesterday. Now that my personal security and physical shelter were absolutely guaranteed, I turned my full, undivided attention back to the corporate battlefield. I sat down at the heavy oak desk in my new sophisticated home office and opened my laptop. It was time to pull my holding company out of the shadows and turn it into a legitimate public-facing weapon. I accessed the state business registry portal and filed the expedited legal paperwork to officially rebrand my limited liability company. I dissolved the quiet, obscure holding name and successfully registered the business as a standalone elite logistics consulting firm. Once the legal registration was securely processing, I began building my digital storefront. I utilized my deep, intimate knowledge of the shipping industry to construct a sleek, aggressive, and highly professional corporate website. I did not rely on vague, useless marketing jargon. I tailored every single sentence and every single graphic directly toward the specific demographics of Harrison's largest, most frustrated clients. The website prominently highlighted my firm's exclusive direct access to the European Maritime Coalition, the Pacific Shipping Conglomerate, and the Transatlantic Union. I explicitly advertised a streamlined modern supply chain solution that eliminated the cumbersome bureaucratic middleman, offering unprecedented efficiency and total transparent pricing. I spent the next several hours meticulously refining the digital infrastructure, ensuring the client contact portals were heavily encrypted and the server capacity could handle a massive influx of internet traffic. I uploaded my professional credentials highlighting my 9 years of hands-on grueling experience managing complex international freight networks. I designed the entire platform to look and function like a modern, agile alternative to the slow, bloated operations of my stepfather's currently failing empire. I wanted his clients to see my website and immediately recognize it as the clear, superior choice for their bleeding businesses. When every single detail was absolutely perfect, I took a slow, deep breath and clicked the publish button, making the new website live to the entire world. I watched the progress bar on the screen fill up with a bright green color, confirming the upload was successful. I sat back in the leather office chair and stared at the glowing monitor, feeling an immense sense of pride wash over me. I had taken the worst moment of my professional career and transformed it into a powerful weapon of independence. I was the chief executive officer of my own destiny. To formally test the contact forms, I sent a quick message through the portal to my own administrative email address. The notification chimed instantly, proving the internal routing was flawless. Tomorrow, I would begin the meticulous process of reaching out directly to the corporate executives I knew were currently screaming at Cameron over the phone. Tomorrow, I would start systematically dismantling Harrison's empire piece by piece. The long, grueling day was finally over, and the real war was just beginning. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse suite, casting a warm, golden glow across the sleek marble kitchen island. I had barely slept, but I did not feel tired. I felt completely energized, fueled by a cold, calculating determination. I brewed a strong pot of coffee and carried my mug over to the heavy oak desk in my home office. I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted files Mia had sent me the previous night. I spent the first hour of my morning meticulously cross-referencing Cameron's fabricated error logs with the actual domestic shipping manifests. It was immediately clear which of Harrison's top clients were suffering the most catastrophic financial losses due to Cameron's intentional sabotage. I compiled a targeted list ranking the companies by the total tonnage of perishable cargo currently rotting on the wrong loading docks. These executives were losing hundreds of thousands of dollars every single hour. They were desperate, furious, and entirely motivated to find an immediate solution. I was going to hand them a permanent lifeline. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the direct cellular number for the chief operations officer of a massive Midwestern grocery conglomerate. This was a man I had worked with closely for the last 7 years. I knew his wife's name, his favorite brand of scotch, and exactly how little patience he had for corporate incompetence. He answered on the second ring, his voice tight with raw stress. He sounded like a man who had spent his entire night screaming at a brick wall. "Harrison's office told me you were completely unreachable," he barked the moment he recognized my voice. "They said you had a total breakdown and vanished, leaving this absolute disaster behind. Tell me right now, Fiona, why I have 40 refrigerated trucks sitting idle in a dead zone outside Detroit while my produce inventory literally turns to mush." I kept my voice perfectly calm, projecting the steady professional authority he desperately needed to hear. "I did not have a breakdown," I replied smoothly. "Harrison and Cameron are lying to you to cover up their own massive internal failures. They fired me 2 days ago because I refused to cover for Cameron's catastrophic mismanagement. They thought they could operate the international supply network without me. They were completely wrong. As you can see, they do not have the slightest idea how to untangle the mess they created." There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. The chief operations officer let out a long, exhausted sigh. "I do not care about your toxic family politics, Fiona. I just need to get my freight moving immediately, or my board of directors is going to demand my resignation by Friday. What are you offering me right now?" I am offering you a permanent escape route, I said, leaning forward in my leather desk chair. I own the exclusive licensing rights to the three largest international freight suppliers. I have completely cut Harrison out of the supply chain, and I have established my own independent elite logistics consulting firm. My digital infrastructure is live, fully operational, and ready to process immediate cargo transfers. If you sign a direct vendor contract with me today, I will personally reroute your stranded fleets within the hour. Furthermore, because we are completely eliminating the bloated corporate middleman, I am prepared to offer you direct access to my entire supplier network at a strict flat 10% discount on your current operational rates. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the gears turning in his mind as he processed the magnitude of my offer. I was not just offering him a temporary fix for his current crisis. I was offering him a massive permanent reduction in his annual transportation budget. I was handing him a victory he could take directly to his demanding board of directors. "Send me the digital contracts right now," he said, his voice suddenly brimming with renewed energy. "I will sign them before I even finish my morning coffee. Harrison is completely dead to us." I smiled and clicked the send button on my laptop, firing off the pre-drafted legal documents directly to his secure email inbox. I promised him his trucks would be moving within the hour and ended the call. A deep rush of satisfaction flooded my chest, but I did not stop to celebrate. I immediately moved down the list. I spoke with regional manufacturing directors, national retail coordinators, and global export managers. Every single one of them was operating in a state of absolute desperation. Every single one of them had spent the last 48 hours listening to Cameron stumble through pathetic fabricated excuses about sudden software glitches and imaginary cyber attacks. When I swept in offering immediate logistical salvation and a significant financial discount, they did not hesitate for a second. They practically begged me to send over the onboarding documents. By the time the clock struck noon, my brand new company had officially absorbed 6 of Harrison's most valuable corporate accounts. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, that number had doubled. I sat back in my chair and watched the live digital dashboard on my computer screen. The visual data representation of my revenge was beautiful. My independent servers were successfully processing thousands of secure routing clearances, redirecting the massive flow of global cargo straight into my private holding network. I was systematically bleeding Harrison's empire completely dry. In a single afternoon, I had aggressively poached roughly 30% of his total active clientele. The sheer speed of the corporate exodus was unprecedented. His remaining executives had to be watching their internal monitoring systems collapse in real time. I could only imagine the absolute terror gripping the boardroom as their largest, most lucrative contracts vanished into thin air without a single warning. They had spent the entire previous day trying to destroy my personal reputation and isolate me from the industry. They completely underestimated my resilience and my strategic precision. I walked into my sleek, modern kitchen to grab a bottle of cold water, letting the quiet hum of the penthouse soothe my focused mind. I took a long drink and leaned against the marble island, staring out at the beautiful freezing waters of the lake. I had successfully established my stronghold. I had proven to the entire shipping industry that I was the actual architect behind my stepfather's success. The empire was officially crumbling under the weight of its own unearned arrogance. I walked back into my home office and woke up my laptop screen to check the latest incoming contract signatures. As my email application refreshed, a new message popped up at the very top of the screen. The email had not come through my secure corporate portal. It was sent directly to my old administrative company address. In their frantic rush to purge me, they forgot to disable my basic server access. I clicked the unexpected message and read the sender name. It was Cameron. Operating in blind panic, he accidentally sent an urgent internal directive to his remaining executives and forgot to blind copy the recipients. Even worse, he mistakenly attached the complete unredacted master client list containing every single direct contact number, pricing tier, and renewals. I stared at the computer screen, completely unable to blink as the magnitude of Cameron's mistake washed over me. He had been trying to send out a frantic company-wide memo to calm the remaining executives, but in his absolute state of panic, he had attached the crown jewels of the empire. I moved my cursor over the file icon and clicked the download button, holding my breath, while the encrypted spreadsheet saved directly to my private server. I opened the document and felt a genuine smile spread across my face. It was all right there. Every single direct cellular number for every chief executive officer, every confidential pricing tier, and the exact dates for every upcoming contract renewal. I did not wait. I spent the rest of the afternoon and early evening systematically dismantling what remained of Harrison's client base. Armed with the master list, I no longer had to wait for angry executives to complain on industry message boards. I reached out to them proactively. I knew exactly where Harrison had been cutting corners for years. I called the vice president of a massive pharmaceutical distributor in Boston and bypassed the usual pleasantries. I told him I knew Harrison had been secretly delaying their temperature-controlled shipments to save fuel costs, resulting in millions of dollars in compromised medical supplies. I offered him a dedicated, uninterrupted freight lane with a guaranteed delivery window and a lower flat rate. He signed the electronic contract before we even ended the call. I moved down the list, striking with surgical precision. I contacted a national retail chain headquartered in Texas and solved a warehouse bottleneck they had been fighting for 3 years. By nightfall, my newly minted consulting firm had secured a roster of elite clients that would normally take a decade to build. I was exhausted, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept my mind razor sharp. I closed my laptop and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of cold water. The sudden harsh ringing of the lobby intercom shattered the quiet of my penthouse. I checked the digital security monitor mounted on the kitchen wall. The concierge was standing at the front desk, looking uncomfortable. He informed me that a court-appointed process server was waiting in the lobby, demanding to deliver an urgent legal document directly to my hands. I told the concierge to send him up. 5 minutes later, I opened my heavy oak door to find a serious-looking man holding a thick manila envelope. He handed it to me, asked me to confirm my name, and walked back toward the elevator without another word. I carried the heavy envelope over to my dining table and tore it open. It was an emergency legal injunction filed in the state court by Harrison's army of corporate lawyers. The dense pages demanded an immediate absolute halt to all my business operations. Harrison was officially accusing me of corporate espionage and breach of contract, claiming I was illegally poaching his clients using proprietary company information. The injunction demanded I shut down my website and return all acquired accounts by 9 o'clock the following morning, or face devastating financial penalties. I reached for my phone and dialed Donovan, my attorney. I read the primary demands of the injunction aloud, expecting him to sound concerned. Instead, Donovan let out a loud, booming laugh that forced me to pull the phone slightly away from my ear. He told me to take a deep breath and throw the entire manila envelope straight into the recycling bin. I asked him how we could possibly ignore a formal court order. Donovan explained the beautiful, hilarious reality of the situation with absolute glee. He told me that in order to enforce a non-compete clause or accuse me of breaching an employment contract, the company actually had to have a signed non-compete agreement on file. 9 years ago, when my mother forced Harrison to give me a job to keep up family appearances, Cameron had been put in charge of my initial hiring paperwork. Cameron wanted to prove he was a capable manager, but he was careless and lazy. I used a standard generic employment template and completely forgot to include the mandatory non-compete addendums and proprietary information clauses that every other executive was required to sign. Donovan assured me that he would have the emergency injunction completely thrown out of the judge's chambers first thing in the morning. Harrison was trying to use a weapon he did not even own. I thanked Donovan profusely and ended the call, letting a deep wave of pure satisfaction settle into my chest. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the dark, freezing waters of the lake. My family had tried to evict me, smear my professional name, and sue me into submission. Every single attack had failed miserably because their entire empire was built on arrogance rather than actual competence. I was untouchable, and they were bleeding out on the corporate floor. I turned away from the window and headed back to my home office to review my new client schedule for the following day. As I sat down in my leather desk chair, The secure encrypted messaging application on my phone let out a soft, distinct chime. I picked up the device and saw a new alert from Mia, my loyal former assistant. I quickly unlocked the screen and opened the application. The message from Mia was frantic and typed in a rush, lacking her usual perfect punctuation. She told me I needed to log into the secure server immediately and look at the new batch of files she was transferring. I opened my laptop and watched the encrypted data packets filter into my designated holding folder. Mia sent a follow-up message explaining that the situation inside the headquarters had escalated from panic to absolute desperation. With 30% of their clientele gone, and more leaving every hour, Harrison was facing an imminent corporate collapse. The board of directors was threatening to remove him by the end of the week if he did not secure a massive influx of operational capital. Mia wrote that Cameron had convinced his father there was only one way to save the company and avoid total bankruptcy. The federal government was currently accepting final bids for a $500 million defense logistics contract to manage military supply distributions across the Midwest. It was a golden ticket that would instantly save the empire. But there was a massive problem. To even qualify for the federal bidding process, a logistics company had to provide 10 years of flawless safety compliance records and vehicle maintenance reports. Harrison's fleet was notoriously outdated and constantly failing state inspections. Mia explained that Cameron was actively bypassing every single standard operational protocol. He was using the administrative network to secretly falsify thousands of pages of safety compliance records and vehicle maintenance logs. He was doctoring the official corporate books to make their failing fleet look like the safest operation in the country. Cameron was preparing to submit fraudulent documents to the federal government to secure a $500 million defense contract. I read the message twice, letting the sheer magnitude of his stupidity sink in. He was committing massive federal fraud. I leaned back in my chair and smiled in the quiet room. They had just handed me the shovel to dig their permanent grave. I read Mia's message again, but this time I focused on timing rather than shock. The false records were being prepared for the federal bid, which meant Harrison could still try to deny responsibility, blame a subordinate, or dismiss the files as unfinished drafts if I exposed them too early. He had spent years surviving by pushing consequences onto other people. I was not going to give him another escape route. The answer became obvious. I needed Cameron and Harrison to commit fully to the bid they believed would save them. I needed them confident enough to submit the records and stand behind them before the federal decision-makers. Only then would their own choices become the trap. I opened the encrypted chat with Mia and told her to stay quiet, preserve what she could safely preserve, and do nothing that might warn them I knew what they were planning. For once, the smartest move was not to attack. It was to let their desperation carry them exactly where they had chosen to go. My first instinct was to pick up my phone and immediately call the federal regulatory agencies. I could blow the whistle right now and watch the authorities storm into Harrison's building before morning. But as I leaned back in my leather office chair, I realized that acting too quickly would be a monumental mistake. If I reported them tonight, Harrison would simply blame the fabricated records on a rogue low-level employee or claim the administrative system had been hacked by an outside source. I had enough money and influence to bury an internal investigation and avoid personal accountability. He would survive, and he would eventually find a way to rebuild his damaged reputation. I could not let that happen. For true absolute justice to take its course, I had to let Cameron finish digging his own grave. I had to let him formally submit that fraudulent bid to the federal directors. Only then would the crime be permanent and entirely inescapable. I typed a quick response to Mia instructing her to stay completely under the radar. I told her not to interfere with Cameron's activities and to simply let him proceed with his disastrous plan. To ensure, Cameron and Harrison walked blindly into their own trap. I knew I needed to give them a false sense of absolute security. They needed to believe the worst of the severe operational storm had finally passed. Over the last 48 hours, I had aggressively poached 30% of their top-tier clients, tearing a massive hole in their annual revenue. If I continued my relentless professional assault, they might panic and sell the company before the federal bid was even formally submitted. I needed them to feel confident enough to proceed with their arrogant criminal scheme. The next morning, I deliberately ceased all offensive business operations. I did not make a single phone call to the remaining lucrative executives on the master client list. It took an immense amount of personal self-control to look at those vulnerable, highly profitable accounts and force myself to just walk away. Instead, I instructed my new dedicated support staff to focus entirely on seamlessly onboarding the massive corporate accounts we had already successfully secured. We spent our days setting up secure digital portals, mapping out new highly efficient freight lanes, and ensuring our current clients were experiencing flawless logistics management without any lingering costly disruptions. The sudden total silence from my consulting firm acted exactly as the perfect irresistible bait. By the end of the long week, the strategic pause was working flawlessly. The frantic industry chatter regarding my aggressive corporate takeover began to noticeably quiet down. Without my daily aggressive phone calls stealing their clients Harrison and Cameron clearly believed I had simply reached my maximum operational capacity. They incorrectly assumed my small independent firm was overwhelmed by the sudden massive influx of business and could not handle absorbing any more of their highly complex accounts. Their characteristic arrogance completely blinded them to the reality of my deliberate, calculated silence. I watched the local evening financial news channels openly confirm their growing misplaced confidence. A brief television segment aired highlighting Harrison's logistics company as a prime frontrunner for the new incredibly lucrative defense logistics contract. The television news anchor enthusiastically praised their long-standing industry presence, completely unaware that the structural foundation of the empire was currently hollowed out and rotting rapidly from the inside. A few more days passed in this quiet, suspended state of heavy tension. I was sitting comfortably at my marble kitchen island, enjoying a late morning cup of hot coffee and reviewing a successful massive cargo transfer from Shanghai when my personal cell phone illuminated on the counter. I glanced down at the bright caller identification and felt my stomach involuntarily tighten. It was my mother. Patricia had not attempted to contact me since the night she maliciously texted me that cruel, mocking eviction notice, threatening to leave me sleeping on the freezing street. I let the phone ring, watching her name repeatedly flash across the smooth glass screen until the call finally rolled over to my digital voicemail. A minute later, a notification chimed softly indicating she had left a recorded message. I set my warm coffee mug down and pressed play, keeping the volume relatively low. Patricia's voice filled the quiet, pristine kitchen, sounding entirely different from the vicious, screaming woman who had violently slapped me in the formal dining room just a couple of short weeks ago. Her tone was carefully modulated, dripping with a soft, manufactured warmth that immediately set all my defensive instincts on high alert. "Fiona, sweetheart." She began, her voice carrying a fragile, trembling quality that sounded heavily and artificially rehearsed. "I know things have been terribly difficult between us lately. We have all said things in the heat of the moment that we deeply and truly regret. I have been doing a lot of deep thinking, and I really want to fix this terrible rift. A loving mother and her daughter should not be fighting like this over silly corporate business. Please let us meet for coffee tomorrow afternoon at that lovely little cafe in the Gold Coast district. Let us just quietly sit down and finally bury the hatchet. I miss you so very much." I deleted the voicemail the moment her fake pleasantries concluded. I knew my manipulative mother far better than anyone else. Patricia never apologized unless she wanted something highly specific, and she never offered an olive branch unless it deeply concealed a sharp hidden blade. She had spent my entire life using my personal vulnerabilities against me to firmly secure her own extremely comfortable position in high society. Her sudden, desperate desire to reconnect and bury the hatchet was nothing more than a calculated, transparent reconnaissance mission. Harrison and Cameron were likely sending her to test the waters to see if I was truly backing down or if I was planning another massive structural strike. They wanted her to exploit our familial bond to gather vital intelligence on my business operations and soothe my lingering anger before the massive federal bid went through. My first impulse was to block her number entirely and ignore the pathetic transparent trap. But as I looked out over the sprawling Chicago skyline, a new, deeply satisfying strategy began to form in my mind. If Patricia wanted to play the role of the loving, concerned mother to protect her husband's failing empire, I was going to let her play the part perfectly. I was going to walk right into her trap and use her own manipulative tactics against her. I picked up my phone and typed a brief, polite text message, accepting her invitation for coffee the following afternoon. I told her I was also exhausted from the fighting and looked forward to seeing her. I hit send and smiled, feeling a cold, profound sense of control. The trap was officially set, but they had no idea who was actually holding the snare. The Gold Coast district of Chicago is renowned for its historic mansions, luxury boutiques, and quiet tree-lined streets. It was exactly the kind of highly sanitized, affluent environment where my mother felt completely in control. I arrived at the upscale French cafe 15 minutes early, ensuring I had ample time to select the perfect table. I chose a small circular marble table tucked away in the back corner of the bustling room. It offered a clear, unobstructed view of the front door, but was sufficiently isolated from the other patrons to allow for a deeply private conversation. I ordered a simple black coffee and sat down, placing my smartphone flat on the table right next to my cup. I opened the voice recording application and pressed the bright red circle. The digital timer immediately began counting upward in silent, steady seconds. I locked the screen, leaving the phone face up. It looked entirely innocuous, just another piece of modern technology resting on a cafe table, but it was actively recording every single sound in the immediate vicinity. I took a deep, steadying breath and waited for her to arrive. Right on time, the brass bell above the cafe door chimed, and my mother walked inside. Patricia was dressed impeccably, wearing a tailored beige wool coat and a silk scarf draped elegantly around her neck. She paused in the entryway, scanning the crowded room until her eyes finally locked onto mine. She did not wear her usual expression of harsh, critical judgment. Instead, her face instantly transformed into a mask of profound, weary sadness. She walked over to my table, her shoulders slumped slightly, as if she were carrying the immense, heavy burden of our fractured family. "Fiona, sweetheart," she murmured, sliding into the chair across from me. She reached across the small marble table and attempted to take my hand. I kept my hands firmly wrapped around my warm coffee mug, denying her the physical contact, but I made sure to soften my facial expression. I needed to look like a daughter who was desperately exhausted from fighting and actively looking for a way out of the war. "You look so tired," Patricia continued, her voice trembling with manufactured maternal concern. "This whole terrible ordeal is just destroying both of us. I have barely slept since that awful night at the house. I hate fighting with you, Fiona. I truly do." I took a slow sip of my coffee, keeping my eyes slightly downcast. I let a long, heavy silence stretch between us, letting her believe her performance was actually working. "It has been a very difficult couple of weeks, Mom," I replied, keeping my tone carefully hesitant and subdued. Patricia let out a soft, theatrical sigh and pulled a pristine tissue from her designer handbag, dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. "I know it has been difficult," she agreed, leaning forward conspiratorially. "But it does not have to be this way anymore. We can fix this mess right now. You have proven how incredibly smart you are. You have proven you can build a business and secure clients. You made your point loud and clear to Harrison and to your brother. Now it is time to come home." I looked up at her, widening my eyes slightly to project a sense of innocent vulnerability. "Come home?" I asked, my voice wavering just a fraction of an inch. "Yes," Patricia insisted, nodding eagerly. "Harrison is willing to be completely reasonable about all of this. If you agree to shut down this new competing business and transfer those international vendor contracts back to the family empire, he is fully prepared to welcome you back. He will even give you a senior executive title and a significant pay raise. We can just sweep this entire ugly misunderstanding right under the rug and go back to being a family." I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her proposal wash over me. She was asking me to surrender my multi-million-dollar company, hand over my exclusive leverage, and willingly walk right back into my beautifully decorated cage. She honestly believed I would trade my hard-earned independence for a fake executive title and a few empty words of validation from a man who recently tried to leave me homeless on the street. I kept my face perfectly neutral, suppressing the burning urge to laugh in her face. I do not know, Mom, I said, looking down at my hands again. I have taken a lot of your clients. I have seen the financial numbers. The logistics network took a massive hit when I left. I am honestly worried about the overall health of the company. Harrison must be furious with me for the revenue I took. Are you sure he is actually willing to forgive me, or is he just desperate because the company is struggling to survive? The bait was perfectly placed. My mother had always possessed a crippling, fatal flaw. Her immense, fragile ego could never tolerate the suggestion that her husband's vast wealth was ever in jeopardy. The moment I implied the family empire was weak and struggling, her sympathetic maternal facade instantly cracked. She straightened her posture, her chin lifting with defensive, arrogant pride. "Struggling!" Patricia scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "Do not be ridiculous, Fiona. We are certainly not struggling. Your little stunt with those overseas suppliers was certainly an annoying inconvenience, but you vastly overestimate your own importance. We are currently finalizing a deal that will make the revenue you stole look like absolute pocket change." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table right next to my actively recording cell phone. "A deal?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly laced with innocent curiosity. "What kind of deal can replace 30% of your global shipping clients in just a few days?" My mother leaned in closer, lowering her voice to an arrogant conspiratorial whisper. She could not resist the overwhelming urge to brag to prove to me that I had not actually managed to hurt them. "Harrison and Cameron are securing a massive federal defense contract." She boasted, a smug, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "The United States government is awarding us $500 million to manage their Midwest military supply distributions. It is practically a done deal at this point. We do not actually need your international routes at all, Fiona. We are just offering you a chance to surrender gracefully before this federal money makes you completely irrelevant." I let out a soft, impressed breath, shaking my head in feigned disbelief. $500 million is incredible, Mom. But those federal defense contracts require a flawless decade of safety compliance records. I managed the fleet maintenance logs for 9 years. Our domestic trucks were constantly failing basic state safety inspections. How on earth did Cameron manage to get past the strict federal safety auditors with our outdated, decaying fleet? Patricia rolled her eyes, letting out a harsh, unsympathetic laugh. "Oh, please, Fiona, you have always been such a rigid stickler for the rules. That is exactly why you do not have the stomach for real elite business. Cameron is simply doing what needs to be done to secure our future. He is adjusting the internal safety logs to reflect what the federal auditors want to see." "Adjusting the logs," I repeated, ensuring her words were caught perfectly by the microphone. "You mean he is rewriting the safety records?" "He is fixing the paperwork," Patricia corrected dismissively. "He has been spending the last 4 days digitally cleaning up the old inspection reports and correcting the maintenance history, so the fleet looks perfectly compliant for the federal bid submission. It is just a minor administrative restructuring. Everyone in the industry does it to get ahead. Cameron is stepping up and saving the company while you are sitting here playing games." I stared at the woman sitting across from me. She had absolutely no idea what she had just done. In her desperate, arrogant attempt to prove that I had not defeated them, she had just confessed to a massive, coordinated federal crime on a crystal-clear digital recording. She had explicitly detailed Cameron's ongoing process of falsifying commercial safety compliance records to defraud the United States government out of $500 million. I reached out and placed my hand over my cell phone. With a quick, subtle movement of my thumb, I stopped the recording and securely saved the audio file directly to my encrypted cloud drive. The heavy, oppressive weight of the last few weeks completely vanished from my shoulders. I had everything I needed. "You know, Mom," I said, my voice dropping the hesitant act and returning to its natural, steady cadence. "You are absolutely right. I do not have the stomach for your kind of business." Patricia smiled broadly, misinterpreting my statement as a complete surrender. "So you will shut down the consulting firm?" she asked eagerly, reaching for her designer handbag. "I can call Harrison right now and tell him you are ready to come home." I pushed my chair back from the small marble table and stood up. I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure. "I am not shutting anything down," I replied, picking up my phone and sliding it into my coat pocket. I just came here today because I needed to hear you say exactly how Cameron was managing the domestic fleet. Patricia frowned, her brow furrowing in deep, sudden confusion. What are you talking about, Fiona? I smiled at her, a genuine, brilliant smile. Thank you for the coffee, Mom, I said, turning away from the table. Good luck with the federal auditors. I did not wait for her to process my words. I walked out of the high-end cafe and stepped into the crisp Chicago afternoon, holding the ultimate weapon right in the palm of my hand. The crisp morning air of Chicago felt electric as I walked back into my penthouse office holding the digital audio file that would finally end my stepfather's reign. I transferred the pristine recording of my mother's arrogant confession directly onto an encrypted physical hard drive, storing it in a fireproof safe hidden inside my closet. I had the undeniable proof of their federal fraud, but simply mailing a thumb drive to a government tip line was not going to give me the absolute closure I needed. I wanted to look Harrison and Cameron directly in the eyes when their entire world collapsed. I needed to be in the room when the trap finally snapped shut, to guarantee my presence at the final federal bid presentation. I had to position myself as an indispensable asset to the United States government. I pulled up my newly acquired master client list and started making highly strategic phone calls. Over the past few weeks, I had successfully rescued several massive manufacturing conglomerates from Harrison's crumbling network. Many of these powerful executives held deep, long-standing relationships with federal defense contractors. I reached out to the chief operations officer of a massive aerospace manufacturing firm, who was absolutely thrilled with the 10% reduction in his freight costs since signing with my consulting firm. I asked him for a direct personal introduction to the regional director overseeing the new defense logistics contract. Given my spotless professional reputation and the massive amount of industry influence my new clients possessed, the introduction was arranged within a matter of hours. The regional director, a stern, uncompromising man named Director Miller, agreed to a brief introductory video conference later that same afternoon. I spent the intervening hours meticulously preparing my presentation. I was not going to pitch my new firm as a potential vendor for the logistics contract. I did not have the sheer volume of domestic trucks required to handle a $500 million military distribution network, and I had absolutely no desire to overextend my newly established company. Instead, I was going to pitch myself as a specialized third-party compliance auditor. When the video conference connected, Director Miller appeared on my screen, sitting in a sparse, sterile office in Washington. He was flanked by two other high-ranking federal procurement officers. They looked tired, impatient, and deeply skeptical of a sudden, unsolicited meeting with an independent logistics consultant. I did not waste their valuable time with hollow pleasantries. I went straight to the point. I told them that the commercial logistics industry was currently suffering from a massive epidemic of falsified safety compliance records. I explained that greedy, desperate executives were actively masking critical fleet maintenance failures by manipulating digital inspection logs and pushing dangerous vehicles onto the public highways. Director Miller leaned forward, his brow furrowing in serious concern. He asked me how I could possibly know these intimate operational details. I calmly informed him that for 9 grueling years I had managed the complex international supply lines for one of the largest logistics empires in the Midwest. I knew exactly how the dark corners of the industry operated because I had spent nearly a decade watching arrogant executives actively ignore my frantic safety warnings to pad their own personal bank accounts. My detailed, intimate knowledge of the exact loopholes and digital blind spots used to trick federal auditors was absolutely undeniable. I shared a redacted sample of a doctored maintenance report, breaking down exactly how desperate companies altered the timestamps on vehicle brake inspections to make an aging, rotting fleet appear brand new on paper. The federal procurement officers exchanged troubled, highly alarmed glances. They were actively preparing to award a $500 million contract to manage critical military supply distributions. If they accidentally awarded that massive contract to a company running a dangerous, uninspected fleet, the resulting public scandal would destroy their entire government careers. I offered them a completely foolproof solution. I proposed that they hire my independent consulting firm on a temporary specialized contract to act as a third-party compliance auditor for the final round of the bidding process. I promised to personally review every single safety log and maintenance record submitted by the final contending companies. With my deep insider knowledge of the exact software vulnerabilities used to fake these reports, I could easily spot a doctored file that a standard government auditor might accidentally overlook. I told them my fee would be an absolute fraction of what a standard consulting firm would charge. Director Miller and his associates muted their microphones for a tense, agonizing 5 minutes while they privately discussed my unprecedented proposal. I sat in my quiet penthouse office, watching their muted conversation on the screen, keeping my face perfectly composed. When they finally unmuted the connection, Director Miller looked directly into the camera with a firm, resolute expression. He told me that my thoroughness and my deep understanding of operational loopholes were exactly what their review board was currently lacking. They hired me right there on the spot. Over the next several days, I received the massive encrypted files containing the final bids from the top 3 logistics companies competing for the defense contract. As I downloaded the heavy files, I immediately searched for the submission bearing Harrison's corporate logo. I opened the massive digital folder and began analyzing the thousands of pages of safety compliance records and fleet maintenance histories that Cameron had personally prepared. It was exactly as my mother had proudly confessed in the coffee shop. The documents were completely entirely fabricated. Cameron had gone through years of failed vehicle inspection reports and digitally altered the results, turning massive safety violations into perfect passing scores. He had completely erased records of severe brake failures, structural rust damage, and blown transmission lines. He had created a beautiful, pristine work of absolute fiction. It was the most blatant, aggressive display of federal fraud I had ever seen in my entire professional life. I meticulously highlighted every single forged entry, building a massive, undeniable portfolio of hard evidence that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Harrison's empire was attempting to steal from the United States government. I forwarded my comprehensive findings directly to Director Miller, along with the audio file of my mother, explicitly confessing to the entire criminal scheme. The response from the federal authorities was immediate and entirely classified. Director Miller informed me that they were involving federal investigators, but they needed to catch Harrison and Cameron completely red-handed during the final mandatory bid presentation. They needed the men to stand in a room and verbally confirm to federal officers that their submitted documents were entirely truthful and accurate. I agreed to attend the final presentation in person to serve as the chief compliance auditor. The morning of the final bid presentation arrived with a bitter, freezing rain washing over the Chicago skyline. I dressed in my sharpest, most expensive tailored suit, channeling every ounce of confidence I had built over the last few grueling weeks. I drove to the secure federal building in the downtown district, passing through 2 heavy layers of armed security before reaching the designated executive boardroom. The room was cold, sparse, and intensely intimidating. I took my assigned seat at the very head of the long, polished table, sitting directly to the right of Director Miller and the other federal procurement officers. We waited in absolute silence. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the conference room swung open. Harrison and Cameron strutted into the room wearing matching custom-tailored suits, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable arrogance. They were smiling broadly, chatting quietly with each other, looking fully confident that their bribed connections and doctored paperwork had flawlessly secured the most lucrative deal of their entire lives. They believed they had completely weathered the massive corporate storm I had caused. Cameron walked toward the front of the room, holding a leather briefcase full of fraudulent documents, while Harrison took a smooth, confident step toward the conference table to happily shake hands with the federal directors. They were completely ready to claim their massive victory and save their dying empire. Then Harrison turned his head and looked toward the front of the room. He froze completely solid. His confident, arrogant smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror as his eyes locked directly onto mine. We were finally ready to begin the ultimate and complete destruction. The blood rushed out of Harrison's face so fast he looked as though he might collapse. His outstretched hand fell to his side. Cameron finally noticed his father's sudden paralysis. He turned his head following Harrison's terrified gaze until his eyes landed on me sitting comfortably at the head of the polished conference table. Cameron blinked, struggling to process the visual information. Then his fragile, arrogant ego aggressively took over. His face twisted into a mask of furious indignation. He slammed his briefcase down onto the table, creating a sharp echo. "What is she doing here?" Cameron shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. He looked frantically at Director Miller. "This is a highly classified government bidding session. That woman is a disgruntled former employee who was fired for gross insubordination. She has no legal right to be sitting in this room. I demand that you have security remove her immediately." I did not say a single word. I simply folded my hands, resting them on the cool surface of the table, and maintained a perfectly neutral expression. I let Cameron dig his own grave with his loud outburst. Director Miller did not look amused by my stepbrother. He adjusted his suit jacket and looked at Cameron with a cold, uncompromising glare that immediately silenced the younger man. "You are severely mistaken about the nature of this meeting, young man," Director Miller stated, his voice ringing with undeniable authority. "This woman is not here as a competing logistics vendor. We hired her independent consulting firm to serve as the chief third-party compliance auditor for this final phase of the bidding process. She has been reviewing every single page of the safety and maintenance records your company submitted to the United States government. She has our full authorization to be in this boardroom today." I watched Harrison stagger backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping clumsily against the carpet. He grabbed the back of a heavy office chair to keep himself standing upright. He knew exactly what kind of falsified documents Cameron had submitted, and he suddenly understood that I was the person hired to inspect them. Director Miller turned his attention away from my panicking family members and looked respectfully at me. He extended an open hand toward the massive digital projection screen mounted on the wall behind him. "The floor is entirely yours," he said, granting me the power to proceed. I stood from my chair, taking a slow, deliberate breath. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with impending doom. I reached into my brief bag and pulled out a digital tablet, syncing it seamlessly to the boardroom projection system. The massive screen flickered to life, casting a bright white glow across the terrified faces of Harrison and Cameron. I tapped the screen, bringing up my first slide. It displayed a side-by-side comparison of two very different digital documents. "Gentlemen," I began, keeping my voice crisp. "On the left side of the screen, you will see the official fleet safety compliance records submitted by Harrison Logistics Empire for this federal contract. As you can see, these documents paint a picture of a flawless modern transportation fleet with perfect inspection scores and pristine vehicle maintenance histories. According to these files, they have not suffered a single brake failure or transmission issue in over a decade." I paused, letting the federal directors absorb the perfect data. Then I tapped the screen again. The document on the right side of the screen expanded, detailing a severe, terrifying reality. "On the right," I continued, "you will see the actual unedited maintenance logs recovered directly from their internal administrative servers. These authentic logs show a decaying, deeply neglected fleet of commercial vehicles. You will notice the severe structural rust damage, the repeated failures during basic state safety inspections, and the alarming rate of blown transmission lines." The company vice president took the original failing inspection reports and digitally altered the timestamps and the mechanical results to fabricate a perfect passing score. They have systematically erased thousands of critical safety violations to artificially qualify for this $500 million federal contract. The federal procurement officers shook their heads in profound disgust, furiously taking notes on their legal pads. Harrison let out a desperate gasping sound. He stepped forward, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of surrender. He was already trying to save his own skin by throwing his biological son directly under the bus. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Harrison pleaded, his voice trembling violently. "If those records were altered, it was done completely without my direct knowledge or approval. We have thousands of employees. It must have been a rogue warehouse manager or a terrible data entry error. We would never intentionally submit fraudulent documents to the federal government. I guarantee you I had no idea this was happening." I looked at Harrison, watching him desperately attempt to lie his way out of a federal crime. He was completely willing to let Cameron take the entire fall, just to protect his own precious freedom and his personal bank accounts. "I am afraid that excuse is entirely invalid, Harrison," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy calm. I tapped the digital tablet one final time. A simple audio file icon appeared in the center of the massive projection screen. "Because the reality is that your entire family was fully aware of this criminal scheme. In fact, your wife proudly bragged about it to me in a public coffee shop just a few short days ago." I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio recording echoed loudly through the sterile federal boardroom. Patricia's arrogant, condescending voice filled the tense space, delivering the final, inescapable execution. "I has been spending the last 4 days digitally cleaning up the old inspection reports and correcting the maintenance history, so the fleet looks perfectly compliant for the federal bid submission," my mother voice boasted through the speakers. "It is just a minor administrative restructuring. Everyone in the industry does it to get ahead. Cameron is stepping up and saving the company while you are sitting here playing games." The audio clip ended, leaving behind a suffocating, devastating silence. I looked directly into my stepbrother's eyes, watching the realization of his permanent failure crush his remaining spirit. Cameron's face drained of all color, and he dropped his briefcase onto the floor. The heavy stack of fraudulent documents spilled out across the pristine federal carpet. Harrison stared blankly at the wall, looking like his soul had just forcibly exited his body. The irrefutable recording completely destroyed his pathetic defense, confirming that the senior leadership was actively encouraging it. Director Miller stood up from the conference table, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, decisive movement. He looked completely resolute. "Your federal bid is officially and permanently rejected," he stated, his voice slicing through the heavy air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black radio, pressing the communication button on the side. "Send them in," he ordered. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room immediately swung open. We all turned to look as a team of federal investigators wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering marched purposefully into the room. They carried official federal warrants and heavy metal handcuffs, ready to begin the destruction of the empire. The lead investigator stepped to the front of the conference table and displayed the federal warrants his team had brought. He informed Harrison and Cameron that the records supporting their defense bid were now the subject of a formal fraud investigation, and that investigators were taking immediate control of the documents, devices, and company materials connected to the submission. Cameron protested at once, accusing me of manipulating the process and demanding to call the corporate legal department. No one reacted to his outrage. Two investigators moved to the papers scattered around Cameron's briefcase and began securing them as evidence. Another agent instructed Harrison to surrender his phone, while a second team was dispatched to the corporate headquarters to preserve the company's servers and original compliance files. Harrison did not shout. He stared at the warrants in stunned silence, finally understanding that this had moved beyond a family dispute or a lawsuit he could bury with money. Cameron kept trying to explain the altered records as clerical mistakes, but every desperate sentence only gave the investigators more to document. Director Miller turned to me and thanked me for completing the emergency compliance review. He said the procurement board had everything it needed from my audit, and that the investigators would handle the criminal inquiry from that point forward. I packed my tablet into my brief bag and stood. As I walked toward the doors, I looked back once. Harrison and Cameron were still in the conference room, surrounded by investigators, their fraudulent bids spread across the table between them. Neither man looked powerful anymore. Outside, the freezing rain had stopped. I drove back toward my penthouse, knowing the trap had closed. What happened next would depend on the evidence they had created themselves. By the time I reached my apartment building, the apocalyptic fallout had already begun. The local and national news networks were completely overwhelmed by the breaking story. I turned on the large television in my living room and watched the spectacular collapse of my stepfather logistics empire broadcast live across the country. News helicopters were circling the corporate headquarters in the downtown loop, capturing aerial footage of dozens of federal vehicles parked haphazardly across the manicured front lawn. Reporters stood on the street corners broadcasting live updates as lines of federal agents marched out of the glass lobby carrying heavy cardboard boxes filled with confiscated hard drives and physical server racks. They were systematically dismantling the entire central nervous system of the company. The financial market reacted to the federal raid with absolute ruthless speed. I pulled up a digital stock ticker on my laptop and watched the company valuation free fall in real time. Within the first 2 hours of the news breaking, the corporate stock prices plummeted from their comfortable high margins down to mere pennies. Major institutional investors and regular shareholders dumped their holdings in a massive frantic panic, resulting in a catastrophic financial bleed that could never be reversed. The empire was bleeding out on the trading floor. Later that same afternoon, my former assistant Mia sent me a highly anticipated encrypted message. She had managed to quietly exit the corporate building before the federal lockdown and was watching the chaos unfold from a safe distance. Mia informed me that the furious board of directors had convened an emergency remote meeting the moment the stock prices crashed. They unanimously voted to formally oust Harrison from his position as chief executive officer, completely stripping him of all remaining corporate authority and completely severing his ties to the company he had built. The next 48 hours brought even more devastating news for my former family. The federal prosecutors formally indicted Cameron on multiple counts of federal wire fraud and document forgery. The evening news showed humiliating footage of my stepbrother being led out of his luxury high-rise apartment wearing handcuffs and crying uncontrollably as cameras flashed in his face. Howe was denied bail due to the severe nature of the government fraud and was transferred directly to a federal holding facility to await his criminal trial. Harrison faced an equally brutal, unavoidable fate. The federal regulatory agencies immediately initiated total asset forfeiture proceedings, freezing every single domestic and offshore bank account tied to his name. The authorities seized his sprawling suburban estate, his private jets, and his collection of expensive sports cars. The man who had once threatened to completely ruin my life and leave me homeless on the winter streets was now officially stripped of his entire massive fortune. Howe was facing decades in federal prison, and he had absolutely no financial resources left to hire the elite legal defense team he so desperately needed. The $2 billion logistics empire that had consumed 9 grueling years of my life was officially completely dead. It was a hollow, decaying shell of its former glory, destined to be sold off in small, fragmented pieces by federal bankruptcy courts. I had not just survived the vicious, toxic fire they had tried to burn me in. I had successfully orchestrated their total, absolute annihilation. I had taken back my personal power and secured my professional independence, ensuring they could never manipulate or control me ever again. I spent the rest of the week peacefully managing my newly acquired elite clients. My independent consulting firm was thriving, generating massive, steady revenue streams that guaranteed my permanent financial security. I treated my dedicated employees with the deep professional respect I had always been denied, fostering a positive, healthy workplace culture. I was completely focused on the bright, expansive future ahead of me. On Friday evening, I was standing in my pristine, modern kitchen, pouring myself a well-deserved glass of expensive red wine. The city lights sparkled brilliantly through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the dark waters of the lake with vibrant, colorful reflections. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the wine, letting the complex, rich flavors wash over my tongue. I felt incredibly calm, deeply grounded, and entirely at peace with the new, beautiful life I had aggressively carved out for myself. Then the quiet, serene atmosphere of my penthouse was suddenly interrupted. The digital intercom mounted on the marble kitchen wall let out a sharp, distinct chime. I frowned, setting my wine glass down onto the smooth counter. I was not expecting any evening visitors or food deliveries. I walked over to the security panel and pressed the communication button, waiting for the lobby concierge to speak. Miss Fiona, the concierge, said, his voice sounding deeply uncomfortable and highly apologetic through the small speaker. I am so sorry to bother you at this hour. There is a woman standing down here in the main reception lobby. She is causing quite a significant disturbance and is loudly demanding to be led up to your private penthouse suite immediately. I felt a tiny, sudden prickle of cold tension at the base of my neck. I calmly asked the concierge for the name of the unexpected agitated visitor. She says that her name is Patricia. The concierge replied, lowering his voice to a careful, discreet whisper. She is carrying 3 very large designer suitcases, and she claims to be your mother. I stared at the digital security monitor, my heart beating just a tiny fraction faster. The grand, majestic empire was now reduced to absolute dust, and my mother was standing at my front door. I kept my eyes locked on the digital security monitor displaying the lobby feed. I watched my mother pace back and forth across the polished floor, clutching the handles of her heavy luggage. She looked frantic and entirely out of her element. I took a slow, calming breath and pressed the communication button on the wall panel. I told the concierge to activate the elevator and send her up to the penthouse floor. I did not do this out of any lingering sense of familial duty or pity. I did it because I needed to look her in the eyes one final time. I set my wine glass down on the smooth marble kitchen island and walked over to the front entryway. I stood perfectly still, waiting for the heavy mechanical hum of the private elevator. The brass bell chimed softly, echoing through my quiet sanctuary. The metal doors slid open, revealing a woman who barely resembled the fierce, arrogant matriarch I had known my entire life. Patricia stepped out into my private foyer, dragging 3 massive designer suitcases behind her. Her pristine blonde hair was completely disheveled, falling flat and stringy around her pale face. The expensive makeup she usually wore like protective armor was heavily smudged around her eyes from crying. She was wearing the exact same white cashmere coat she had worn the day she demanded I beg for my job in the corporate lobby, but now it looked wrinkled and deeply sad. She dropped the heavy luggage handles and looked at me, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. The moment our eyes met, she completely broke down. It was not the theatrical, manufactured crying she had used in the coffee shop to trick me. These were real, desperate, ugly tears born from absolute, total ruin. "Fiona, please," she sobbed, her voice cracking violently. "You have to let me stay here with you. The federal agents came to the house this afternoon. They locked the front gates and forced me to leave with only the things I could carry. They froze my checking accounts and seized all the credit cards. I went to a hotel, but my payments were declined. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." She took a step toward me, holding her shaking hands out in a pathetic, pleading gesture. I did not move an inch. I kept the heavy oak door firmly planted between us, serving as an impenetrable physical boundary. "You have an entire luxury penthouse all to yourself," she cried desperately, gesturing to the expansive space behind my shoulders. "I can stay in the guest room. I will not be any trouble at all. I am your mother, Fiona." A daughter should never abandon her mother when she has absolutely nothing left in the world. We are family, and family takes care of each other in times of terrible crisis. She was trying to weaponize the very concept of familial loyalty that she had spent my entire lifetime actively destroying. When the guilt trip did not immediately work, her tone shifted into a desperate, frantic apology. "I know I made terrible mistakes," she wept, wiping her running mascara with the back of her trembling hand. I was completely blinded by Harrison and his immense wealth. I got so caught up in maintaining our social status that I forgot how to be a proper mother to you. He controlled everything, and I was just too terrified to stand up to him. I am so deeply sorry for how I treated you. Please, sweetheart, just let me come inside, and we can finally fix our relationship." I stood in the quiet entryway and stared at the woman weeping on my welcome mat. I looked down at the 3 massive designer suitcases she had dragged all the way across the city. Even in her moment of absolute catastrophic ruin, her very first instinct was to pack her most expensive luxury items and run directly to the nearest source of financial security. She was not crying because she lost her daughter or because she felt any genuine remorse for her decades of systematic abuse. She was only crying because she had lost her comfortable elite lifestyle, and she desperately wanted me to fund a brand new one for her. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of maternal attachment. I actively looked for pity or sadness or even residual anger. I found absolutely nothing inside me. The deep emotional well where my love for her used to reside was completely bone dry. I felt a profound, serene indifference wash over my entire soul. "You are not sorry because you were blinded by wealth," I said, my voice remaining perfectly flat and calm. You are only sorry because the wealth is entirely gone now. You happily threw me out into the freezing street when you thought Harrison held all the power. You mocked my sudden eviction, and you told me I deserved to be homeless and destitute. Now that the tables have completely turned against you, you suddenly want to remember that we share the exact same blood. You do not want a daughter, Patricia. You just want a new, very convenient, wealthy landlord. Patricia let out a loud, dramatic sob, falling to her knees on the expensive hallway carpet. Please, Fiona, she begged, gripping the edge of my door frame. You cannot do this to me. I looked down at her, feeling the final heavy chain of my past break completely away. I reached out and grabbed the solid brass handle of my front door. You have 30 minutes to get off my property before I call security, I said, echoing the exact same cruel threat she had used against me. Good luck. I pushed the heavy oak door forward, closing it firmly and decisively right in her face. The latch clicked, locking her out of my life forever. I turned and walked back toward the beautiful sparkling city lights. The freezing winter eventually thawed, giving way to a warm Chicago spring. 6 full months passed rapidly. I stepped out of the private elevator onto the top floor of a sleek commercial building located in the downtown business district. This was the brand new official headquarters for my highly successful independent logistics consulting firm. I walked happily through the front doors, ready to begin another extremely busy, productive workday. The expansive office space was bustling with positive energy. The walls were painted in soft tones and natural sunlight poured through the large wrap-around windows, illuminating the rows of collaborative open-concept desks. I walked down the main corridor, greeting my employees by their first names. I stopped to ask a junior coordinator about his weekend and approved a generous paid time-off request for a senior analyst who needed to attend her daughter's school play. As I approached the glass-walled executive suite at the end of the hall, my head of operations stepped out to greet me. Mia looked completely transformed from the anxious, overworked administrative assistant she used to be at the old empire. She wore a sharp-tailored suit and carried a tablet filled with our daily routing schedules, projecting an aura of professional confidence. Good morning, Fiona, Mia said, handing me a fresh cup of hot coffee. The morning freight transfers from the European Maritime Coalition just cleared customs without a single delay. We are currently operating at maximum efficiency across all domestic and international sectors. I thanked Mia and took a sip of the warm coffee, feeling a deep sense of pride in everything we had accomplished together. She smiled and gestured toward the employee break room, located just down the hall. You might want to grab a pastry and look at the television monitor in the lounge, Mia suggested, her voice dropping to a quiet, satisfied tone. The local financial news network is running a follow-up segment on the collapse. I think it will provide a very nice start to your morning. I followed her advice and walked into the spacious employee break room. A few of my analysts were sitting at the tables eating breakfast and watching the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall. I stood quietly near the doorway and directed my attention to the morning broadcast. The news anchor was standing in front of a familiar brick courthouse, delivering a comprehensive update on the massive federal fraud case that had captivated the city for half a year. The screen cut to footage of Cameron dressed in a drab standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The arrogant golden child was standing before a federal judge looking pale, exhausted, and entirely broken. The news anchor reported that Cameron had officially accepted a harsh federal plea deal to avoid a lengthy public trial. He formally pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and document forgery. The judge sentenced him to 72 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by 5 years of strict supervised release. The broadcast then shifted to Harrison. My former stepfather was shown walking out of a downtown legal clinic, shielding his face from the aggressive flashing cameras. The reporter detailed the absolute totality of his financial ruin. Harrison had been forced to declare total personal bankruptcy. The federal government had successfully seized and liquidated every single one of his hidden offshore accounts, his luxury properties, and his massive stock portfolios to pay off the catastrophic corporate fines. He was left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of unpayable legal debt and a permanently destroyed professional reputation. Finally, the news segment showed a brief blurred video clip taken by a local citizen journalist. It showed Patricia working behind the cash register of a high-end retail boutique in a quiet suburban outdoor mall. The woman who had once demanded I beg for my job and threatened to leave me homeless was now forced to work a minimum wage retail job just to afford a tiny rented apartment. She was shown awkwardly folding a stack of designer sweaters for a wealthy customer, looking deeply humiliated by her drastic fall from grace. I watched the screen for another moment, feeling a profound, quiet sense of absolute closure. The universe had finally balanced the scales. I turned away from the television, walked out of the break room, and entered my spacious corner office. The room was perfectly quiet, offering a beautiful, unobstructed view of the majestic Chicago skyline. I sat down in my comfortable leather chair and placed my hands flat on the smooth surface of my desk. I had built this entire sanctuary with my own two hands, relying solely on my intelligence, my resilience, and my unwavering determination. Suddenly, the sleek multi-line telephone sitting on the corner of my desk let out a sharp, bright ring. I glanced at the digital caller identification display and felt my heart skip a single excited beat. The incoming call was originating from an international number, specifically a highly secure executive line located at the primary port authority in Singapore. They were one of the largest, most powerful maritime shipping hubs on the entire planet. I reached out and picked up the receiver, bringing it slowly to my ear. The senior director of the port greeted me with a deeply respectful tone. He explained that he had been closely monitoring the explosive, unprecedented growth of my independent logistics firm. He was incredibly impressed by my flawless operational record and my uncompromising safety standards. I was calling to officially offer my company an exclusive, highly lucrative global partnership that would instantly double our international freight capacity. I leaned back, looking out at the beautiful, sparkling city. I thought about the miserable, freezing morning I was fired and the desperate attempts to completely destroy my personal life. They had deliberately thrown me directly into a toxic fire, expecting me to burn to absolute ashes. I smiled, pressing the phone closer to my face. I now owned the matches.